It has been an absolute shocker across the board in terms of a year. And SDRs and AEs, I want you to listen to this, and it's going to be an uncomfortable watch and it's going to be shit at times, but I think it's super important because you're going to have to reevaluate your career paths next year. Those deals ain't moving. There's no momentum behind them. What you thought was urgent to the business changed. What you thought was a priority clearly wasn't. Let's start with quota attainment. In SaaS, this year just gone, we saw the worst levels of quota attainment across the board, which meant that even mid-cycle, what was a priority was no longer a priority, because the priority became whatever you do, batten down the hatches and do not spend at all costs. Do not spend. You weren't getting any answers, and you probably didn't up until now. And even now, you're probably not getting the answers. I'm just looking at you directly right now. How are you going to do this? Because if you don't have a plan, or your only plan is to be, well, end of another year, start of another year, I'm going to continue as I did, you're going to be out of a job. If you can get there first when buyers are already on their buying journey but haven't made themselves known to you, and you can intercept them at that point and be first, you are 70% of those times going to win that deal. Guys, welcome to a very special episode of the Sell the Future podcast. You'll be watching this at the start of January 2026. So in this episode, I want to do a recap of 2025, a year in SaaS, and then we're going to preview what you sellers need to do in 2026 to be successful. This is going to be grim. There's no other way of putting it. It has been an absolute shocker across the board in terms of a year. So I'm going to dive in with some statistics and some data and some real highlights, or rather lowlights, of 2025. And SDRs and AEs, I want you to listen to this, and it's going to be an uncomfortable watch and it's going to be shit at times, but I think it's super important because you're going to have to reevaluate your career paths next year based on the data of what 2025 showed us and what projections of 2026 look like already. You are really going to have to reevaluate your career, your lives. And if you want this, you're going to have to become great. And when I say great, it's like a standard we haven't seen before. If you're up for the fight, stay tuned. Let's jump into the review of 2025. And I mean, where do we start? Well, let's start with quota attainment. In SaaS, this year just gone, we saw the worst levels of quota attainment across the board. Enterprise AEs finished at less than 40% attainment, 38% attainment. And that is when there was a bit of a late Q4 bump, because that was closer to 25% only 2 months ago or 3 months ago going into Q4. Outside of enterprise, wasn't really much better. The SaaS average hovering around 40% attainment, which means 3 out of 5 reps are missing their target. Guys, target is what we need to hit. That's not a, oh, it'd be nice to get to target. It's I have to get to target. Now compare that to 2022, just going back 3 years. Attainment was around the 65-66% mark, and in some industries, well into the 80%. Now look where we are. 91% of teams failed to hit their full year revenue expectations. So 9 out of 10 B2B companies failed to hit their full year revenue expectations, meaning 9 out of 10 sales teams failed to hit their team target. Just going to let that sink in. The sales cycles bloat. Deals on average across the SaaS space took 20% longer to close than they did in 2024. 20% longer. Why? These are the questions we need to ask ourselves. Why were deal cycles longer? Because apart from the fact that CFOs have been handed a very stringent budget and mandate, there was also a lot more red tape added to the process. Businesses weren't really going to buy unless you absolutely nailed their pain point and it being within their top one or two priorities from a business-wide perspective. If you failed to do that at any point in your sales cycle, it dwindled or it stalled. But the fact that deals took 20% longer meant there was a lot more deal management involved. And that deal management is multiple stakeholders. That deal management is understanding how the buying process works, not historically, but how it works now in this present day. How did it work in 2025 when you were running that deal? Because it was different to any prior year. Then we've got to take into account the ghost factor. 34% of deals in the pipeline didn't just lose, meaning you didn't reach a resolution as close lost. They simply slipped or stalled indefinitely. Why? CEOs were moving from efficiency to total lockdown. Ghosted. But those deals ain't moving. There's no momentum behind them. What you thought was urgent to the business changed. What you thought was a priority clearly wasn't. The economic landscape was ever changing. There was loads of knock-on effects. Shit policies from governments withholding information, saying they're not going to raise corporate taxes, and they did. All of these things play a part, but it's the silence in between saying they won't, then saying actually we might, and providing that uncertainty that we saw, that businesses saw in that landscape, which meant that even mid-cycle, what was a priority was no longer a priority, because the priority became, whatever you do, batten down the hatches and do not spend at all costs. Do not spend. This was happening to a lot of your guys' sales cycles, and it was happening whilst you're in the middle of them. And at the time, you weren't getting any answers, and you probably didn't up until now. And even now, you're probably not getting the answers. Not fully. Companies and businesses, SaaS businesses, a lot of them, I'm not talking about the minority that were raising ultra billion-dollar rounds. I'm talking about the majority that weren't able to raise funding, that therefore had to cut jobs, that had to streamline processes mid-cycle with the threat of corporate taxes looming over them. The uncertainty meant they couldn't move a lot of the times. And this is something that you guys need to be aware of going into 2026. Now, let's talk about layoffs and redundancies. Here's some statistics for you. Salesforce cut nearly 5,000 roles, primarily support and success, but also sales teams. CEO Mark Benioff famously stated he simply needed fewer heads because Agentforce AI now handles 50% of customer queries. But they laid off 4,000, and then they laid off a further 1,000 a couple of months later. All departments, give or take, were affected. Then you got the bloodbath. 27 plus thousand roles cut. Intel. Microsoft, 15,000 plus roles. Amazon, over 14,000 roles. Between 2024 and 2025, there were over 250,000 redundancies and layoffs. This wasn't just trimming the fat, guys. This was a calculated surgical restructure of the SaaS workforce. We saw 34% of teams last year had cut their SDR team in half or more. We saw businesses completely getting rid of their SDR teams and running incredibly streamlined with the use of AI, with the use of the implementation of AI, and getting AI to do the grunt work, so to speak, that SDRs get labeled for in terms of job role. According to Gartner, leadership sees the 18% overall growth as a step in the right direction. But let's take it to ground level. Sellers, more than 3 out of 5 sellers missed quota, missed target, which means you didn't hit your number, you didn't make as much money as you should have or could have made. There's a big disconnect between senior leadership and executive metrics and sellers' reality. And sellers, I hate to say it, but these lot at the top, the senior leadership, are not going to bail you out. They're going to set your targets. There was an increase in targets going into 2025. There was a decrease of teams. And that decrease in size of teams, I'm talking about sales teams, is going to continue into 2026. But do you think SDRs, AEs that are still listening, and by the way, if you are still listening, do like and subscribe. It helps me get my message out to more people. And trust me, they need to hear it. As do you. Do you think SDRs and AEs that businesses are going to reduce targets or carry on increasing targets? How do you think that trend is going to go, and how do you think that's going to work out for you? Bear that in mind. We're going to come back to that shortly. Now, moving into 2026, what does all of this mean for this coming year? The adapt or exit year is what I'm calling it. Industry leaders are predicting, this is a prediction, that AI native SaaS companies will run with 50% smaller sales teams than in 2024. If you aren't in the top 20% of your organization, statistically, you're at risk of redundancy. Now, what's happening, SDRs, BDRs? What's happening to the traditional SDR role? It's been engulfed by AI, right? That's how a lot of businesses were able to justify streaming down their or streamlining their SDR teams in 2025. Look at the data. Those menial tasks that businesses feel AI can do have led to them shedding and cutting teams. But the numbers are going to increase. So what does that mean? When I say numbers, I mean target for 2026. It means we're going to try and do more with less. It means that SDRs, you now not only need to understand how to leverage AI, you are going to have to become a super SDR. You've got your AI doing your work and making sure you're running efficiently. And on top of it, You're going to have to understand the nuance of every single conversation in real time and make sure that you become incredibly inquisitive and incredibly smart and astute about identifying business pain points quickly, understanding where the gap is, and understanding that this is now a priority within the business. You're going to have to do it through discovery, do it through really intelligent discovery, because businesses are not going to want to sit down and listen to you go through your questions that you've written down like a checklist. They're going to hang up. No one's got time for it. You're going to have to become a super SDR. Incredible at discovery, incredible at reading between the lines and understanding nuance in conversation, and becoming really effective at closing and booking those meetings in and then following up to make sure that no momentum is lost, and they then attend those meetings, because the attendance rates were abysmal. The reading was dismal in 2025, from meeting booked to meeting sat. It's falling on those super SDRs, and it's going to fall on them in 2026. And if you're not going above and beyond and working in the most efficient manner possible, you'll get cut. Quota is the new floor, not the ceiling. We live in this world, but we have done in the last couple of years, where quota is seen as the ceiling. If you hit quota, you're in the minority. And whilst that is true, it isn't going to be acceptable for businesses because targets are still increasing. In 2026, for a lot of you sellers, hitting 100% is going to be seen as the minimum. We've talked about this in a previous podcast. CFOs are no longer approving nice to have solutions. It's gone. If they view it as a nice to have, it means you haven't done your job properly, or it is just a nice to have. But more realistically and more likely, you've not done your job properly to bridge the understanding of their gap that they have in place and why it is a priority for them and an urgent priority. If they don't see it as that, that deal's not happening, and it's going to fall on you. The relationship only rep, done, finished. Buyers in 2026 and in 2025, they're 60, 65, 70% sometimes already through their buyer journey before you even speak to them. Which means they're going to have zero patience for your discovery call, but also that speed is going to kill. There's data out there that suggests over 70% of deals are won by the seller who makes contact first. Buying intent is going to be the most important metric, or signal rather, that you are going to be talking about and seeing in 2026. If you can get there first when buyers are already on their buying journey but haven't made themselves known to you, and you can intercept them at that point and be first, you are 70% of those times going to win that deal. 7 times out of 10 minimum, which means speed kills, which means efficiency, which means leveraging AI correctly. Guys, you're going to have to look at yourselves long and hard in the mirror. Do you want to be part of this environment? Because it is going to get even worse, and it's pretty horrendous already. You're going to have to be really honest with yourselves. Do you want part of this? Do you want any of this heat? Because there's easier careers out there, especially if you're just starting out your journey. Once you get into SaaS, okay, now you've made a choice. You're staying in SaaS. But we got to revisit this. You got to be honest with yourselves. Is this the right spot for me? Because most people in my industry are not hitting target. Have you got it in you? Because you're going to have to hit target just to survive. This is the reality. 2024 was bad. 2025 was shit. And 2026 targets are going up. And competition for seats has gone up because when you have so many layoffs, so many redundancies, and then you have businesses using AI to streamline their teams even further, you now have sellers that have been, and I'm talking about good sellers that have been let go in 2025, fired on the spot, and then have to compete with all the other sellers for another job elsewhere. If there's less jobs available, there is high demand. This is simply supply and demand, which means you are now also going to enter a rat race within a rat race. You're going to try and get a job and compete with all your peers, sometimes hundreds of people applying for this one job. And then you're going to have to perform to keep your job. SDRs, AEs, you're going to have to close business. But how are you going to close if you haven't done your deep discovery and you haven't found relevant pain points? Now, normally I come on this podcast and I screen share and I walk you through stuff, but I'm just looking at you directly right now. How are you going to do this? Because if you don't have a plan, or your only plan is to be, well, end of another year, start of another year, I'm going to continue as I did, you're going to be out of a job. You need to understand what it is you need to do. And I'm not saying go out there and buy all these courses that coaches and gurus are selling. I'm not saying enroll in endless one-to-one coaching. But you are going to have to level up because we are going to have to see the best version of any SaaS seller we have ever seen in the history of SaaS, and then add 10%. And that's not even going to be what it takes for you to get the President's Club. To get the President's Club, you are going to have to smash it out of the park in, without doubt, the toughest SaaS environment we've ever seen. There'll be SaaS sellers telling you from back in the day, oh, we know what we're doing. We know how to make it. Okay, cool. Jump on the phone. Love to see you try. Yeah, it's tough. It's more than tough. Tough is an understatement. You either bridge that gap between human intuition and technical execution, or you risk being in the list for the next round of redundancies. That is what we're facing, sellers. Is that what you want? Totally up to you. Guys, I know that was a very somber version of what we normally do on the Sell the Future podcast, but we had to review the year, and by all accounts, it was shit. And by all accounts, it's unfair with the moving goalposts, and that's life. Life isn't fair, right? Now, I do believe that you're going to need some sort of cheat code going into next year. And that's what I'm working on. More to follow in the coming weeks and months. But this is what it's going to have to take, because you're going to have to learn how to fight dirty, because we're in a filthy environment, and we're going to have to fight dirty, because if we're losing our jobs, SDRs are getting fired, A's are getting let go, and the A's and SDRs that are remaining are expected to do more than they ever have done before individually, just to survive and keep their seat. Then fuck it, we need a cheat code, right? Guys, if you enjoyed that, and even if you didn't, you probably need to hear it. If you're a SDR or a SaaS seller of any type, or you're in the SaaS space, you're in the right place. You should be listening to this podcast, and you should be liking it, and you should be subscribing, and you should be tuning in to the next episode. If you're not sick of me, I promise you won't get that version of me in this next video over here. So click it, and I'll see you in there.